The tragedy of Louis XVII did not begin with the guillotine, but with the poisonous sexual rumors that suffocated his cradle. From the moment of his birth, Louis Charles was viewed through the lens of a grotesque obsession with the private life of his mother, Marie Antoinette. Branded by the underground press as a tribade engaged in unnatural female relationships, the queen was painted as a sexual monster, and her son was seen as the corrupted fruit of this Italian vice. It was this weaponized paranoia about gender and morality that the Jacobins would ultimately use to break the boy's soul, forcing the 8-year-old Louis Charles to testify to crimes of incest that would send his own mother to her death. His early years, however, were shielded from this harsh reality by the velvet curtains of the palace. He was a vibrant, robust child, far healthier than his older brother, the first Dauphin, who was sickly and frail. Louis Charles was the picture of angelic beauty, with cascading blonde curls and large, expressive blue eyes that seemed to hold a premature intelligence. He was doted upon, particularly by his mother, who found in him a chaotic energy that matched her own desire for life. She called him her little cabbage, her chou d'amour, and contrary to the rigid protocols of the court, she spent hours playing with him, allowing him a familiarity that shocked the older courtiers. But even this maternal affection was twisted by the enemies of the crown. The queen's intimacy with her children, her desire to educate them personally and keep them close, was reinterpreted by the rumor mill as something sinister, a lack of royal distance that hinted at a lack of moral boundaries. The seeds of the incest accusation, which would bloom into such a horrific flower in the Temple prison years later, were unwittingly planted in these days of sunshine and gardens, where a mother's love was scrutinized by eyes looking for perversion. The golden cage began to rattle violently in 1789. Louis Charles was only 4 years old when the Estates General were summoned, opening the floodgates of the Revolution. But for the child, the political cataclysm was overshadowed by a personal tragedy. In June of that year, his older brother died of tuberculosis. The death was agonizing and slow, and it thrust the 4-year-old Louis Charles into the position of Dauphin, the heir apparent to the throne of France. He was too young to understand the weight of the crown that hung over his head, but he was old enough to feel the grief that shattered his parents. The king and queen were devastated, yet the nation had no tears for them. When the delegation from the Third Estate came to pay their respects, they were cold, focused only on their political demands. The child saw his father weep, a sight that must have been terrifying for a boy who had been taught that the king was God's lieutenant on earth. It was his first lesson in the vulnerability of power. Then came October, the days that would end the fairy tale forever. On October 5th, 1789, a massive crowd composed largely of market women marched from Paris to Versailles in the driving rain, demanding bread and the blood of the queen. Louis Charles watched from the windows as the sea of pikes and angry faces surged against the iron gates of the palace. He heard the roar of the mob, a sound like a breaking ocean, screaming for the Austrian woman's guts. The violence of that night was the child's baptism into the reality of the revolution. He saw the royal bodyguards slaughtered, their heads hacked off and mounted on pikes. He was snatched from his bed by his governess, Madame de Tourzel, and rushed through the secret corridors to the king's apartments just moments before the mob broke into the queen's bedchamber, stabbing her mattress with bayonets. The family was reunited in the king's room, listening as the doors splintered under the blows of axes. The terror of that night imprinted itself on the boy's psyche. The realization that the walls could not protect them, that the people did not love them, and that his mother was the target of a hatred so visceral it defied explanation. The next day, the royal family was forced to leave Versailles forever. It was a funeral procession for the monarchy, though the king still lived. The carriage ride to Paris took hours, moving at a snail's pace surrounded by the mob. The heads of the murdered guards were bobbing on pikes outside the carriage windows, their dead eyes staring in at the terrified children. The crowd chanted obscene slogans, calling the queen a whore and the children the bastards of the Austrian. Louis Charles, sitting on his mother's lap, asked with the innocent confusion of a 4-year-old, "Mama, why do they hate us so much? Have we done something wrong?" It was a question Marie Antoinette could not answer. They were brought to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a dusty, abandoned royal residence that had not been used in decades. It was dark, cold, and essentially a prison. They were captives of the city, watched day and night by the National Guard. For the next 2 years, the Tuileries became a theater of anxiety. Louis Charles grew up in this claustrophobic atmosphere, where every servant might be a spy and every cheer from the street might be the prelude to a massacre. Yet his education continued. The king, a man of intellect who preferred books to battles, took personal charge of his son's geography and history lessons. They would study maps of France, a kingdom that was slipping through their fingers. The queen, meanwhile, focused on his character. She wrote in letters to his governess that she wanted to raise him not as a haughty prince, but as a compassionate man aware of the suffering of others. But outside the palace walls, the pornographic press was ramping up its attacks. The narrative was shifting. They were no longer just attacking the queen. They were beginning to look at the air. If the tree is poisonous, they argued, the fruit cannot be safe. The pamphlets began to suggest that the boy was being raised in a harem of women, that he was being effeminized, that he was destined to be a tyrant of vice like Nero or Caligula. The tension broke in June 1791 with the flight to Varennes. It was a desperate gamble, a midnight escape attempt to reach loyalist troops in the east. For the escape, the 6-year-old Louis Charles was dressed as a girl, a disguise necessary for the cover story of a Russian baroness traveling with her family. This detail, though practical at the time, would be seized upon later by the revolutionaries as proof of the gender inversion and forced feminization practiced by the queen upon her son. The boy, sleepy and confused, played his part, but the escape was a disaster. They were recognized, stopped at the town of Varennes, and dragged back to Paris in humiliation. The return journey was worse than the exit from Versailles. The silence of the crowds was more menacing than their shouting. The dust from the road coated their faces, making them look like ghosts. The National Assembly suspended the king's powers. The fiction of a constitutional monarchy was crumbling. The boy was no longer just a Dauphin. He was a hostage of the state. The year that followed, leading up to the summer of 1792, was a slow death. The monarchy was dying by 1,000 cuts. The king fell into a deep depression, often sitting for hours without speaking. The queen became the de facto leader, frantically writing coded letters to foreign courts begging for help. Louis Charles, sensitive to the moods of his parents, became prone to nightmares. He would wake up screaming, dreaming of wolves and pikes. The revolutionaries, meanwhile, were radicalizing. The moderate voices were being drowned out by the Jacobins and the Cordeliers, men like Robespierre, Danton, and the vile Hébert, who saw the royal family not as people, but as a cancer to be excised. They began to refer to the king as Monsieur Veto and the queen as Madame Veto, stripping them of their titles. The boy became the wolf cub. Then came the 10th of August, 1792, the day the monarchy fell. The mob, organized and heavily armed, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The sound of the Swiss guards firing their muskets, the roar of the cannon, the screams of the dying. It was the soundtrack of the apocalypse for the 7-year-old prince. The family fled across the gardens to the National Assembly, taking refuge in a small reporter's box, a suffocatingly hot cage-like space where they stayed for hours, listening to the debates about their own deposition while the slaughter continued outside. They could hear the screams of their servants being butchered. They saw the crown jewels and personal possessions being looted. When they finally emerged, the 1,000-year-old French monarchy was dead. Louis XVI was now just Louis Capet, and his son was a citizen of a republic that had no use for princes. 3 days later, they were transferred to the temple. The temple was a medieval fortress, a remnant of the Knights Templar, a gloomy, imposing stone structure that dominated the skyline of the Marais district. It was not a palace, it was a dungeon. At first, the family was kept together in the smaller tower. The conditions were harsh, but they had each other. The king continued to teach his son Latin and geography. The Queen and Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister, taught him mathematics and drawing. In the evenings, they would play board games, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy for the children. But the eyes of the commune were always upon them. Guards were stationed in their rooms, blowing smoke in the queen's face, drawing lewd graffiti on the walls, and singing obscene songs about the Austrian whore within earshot of the children. It was in this pressure cooker of the temple that the psychological demolition of the boy began in earnest. The guards would purposefully leave revolutionary newspapers where the family could see them, papers filled with graphic cartoons of the queen engaging in sexual acts with guards, with women, even with animals. They wanted the family to see the filth. They wanted the boy to see it. It was a form of psychological warfare, a breaking down of the barriers of dignity. The revolutionaries were obsessed with the idea that the royal family was hiding something, a secret correspondence or a secret plot. But more than that, they were obsessed with the secret vices of the aristocracy. They watched the interactions between the mother and son with a predatory gaze, interpreting every hug, every kiss, every caress as evidence of something unnatural. In December 1792, the king was separated from his family to prepare for his trial. The farewell was heart-wrenching, but the boy remained with his mother. The king's execution on January 21, 1793, was a trauma that shook the very foundations of the boy's world. He heard the cannons firing to announce the death of his father. He saw his mother collapse in a faint and his aunt freeze in horror. At that moment, according to the royalist tradition, the boy became King Louis XVII. His mother curtsied to him, acknowledging his sovereignty. But to the Republic, he was now simply an orphan of a traitor, a dangerous symbol that had to be neutralized. The execution of the father removed the patriarchal head of the family, leaving the boy solely in the care of the women, his mother and his aunt. And this is where the revolutionary paranoia shifted into overdrive. In the misogynistic worldview of the Jacobins, a boy raised entirely by women, and depraved women like Marie Antoinette at that, was in mortal danger of being corrupted, of being feminized, of being turned into a monster. They believed that the Republic required virile men, and that the environment of the temple was a hotbed of aristocratic softness and vice. The whispers began to turn into a roar in the convention. "We must remove the child from the mother," they argued. "She is poisoning his mind and his body." The accusations of incest were not yet public, but they were being whispered in the corridors of power. Men like Hébert were already formulating the narrative. The queen was not just a traitor to the state, she was a traitor to nature, and the boy was the evidence. The spring of 1793 passed in a haze of grief and fear inside the temple. The boy's health began to suffer. He grew thin and pale, the stress of the imprisonment taking its toll on his developing body. He suffered from a stitch in his side and the beginnings of the scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that would later kill him. But his mother tended to him with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. She knew deep down that they would come for him. She barely let him out of her sight. They slept in the same room, a fact that the guards noted with lecherous interest. Every time she dressed him, every time she tended to his medical needs, the guards were watching, their minds twisted by the propaganda they read daily, seeing sin where there was only maternal care. They were waiting for the order to strike, to tear the child away and begin the process that they called Republican education, but which history would record as the systematic torture of a soul. The golden curls of Versailles were gone, the shadows of the temple were lengthening, and the darkness was about to swallow the boy whole. The summer of 1793 descended upon Paris like a suffocating blanket, the heat rising from the cobblestones carrying the stench of stagnant sewage and spilled blood. Inside the temple, the air was heavy and still, thick with the humidity that clung to the stone walls and made the very act of breathing feel like a labor. For the royal women and the young prince, the atmosphere was charged with a terror that had no name, but was felt in every glance exchanged, every footstep echoing in the stairwell. The execution of the king in January had not satiated the thirst of the revolution. It had only made it more ravenous. The Republic was under siege from foreign armies at the borders and royalist rebellions in the Vendée, and in their panic, the Jacobin leadership turned their eyes inward, looking for the enemy within. And there, in the medieval tower, sat the ultimate enemy, the 8-year-old boy whom the royalists called Louis XVII. To the Committee of Public Safety, he was a living bomb, a rallying point for every counter-revolutionary in Europe. As long as he remained in the care of his mother, they reasoned, he was being nurtured in hatred for the Republic. The logic of the terror demanded a surgical strike. The limb must be severed to save the body politic. The boy must be taken. It was the night of July 3rd, 1793. The clock had long since struck 9, and the darkness in the tower was absolute, save for the flickering of a single candle that cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling plaster of the walls. The young Louis Charles was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the fitful rhythm of a child who had learned to fear his own dreams. Marie Antoinette sat by his bedside, mending a piece of clothing, her eyes red-rimmed from months of weeping, yet dry now, hardened by a resolve that was all she had left. Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, and Marie-Thérèse, her teenage daughter, sat nearby, reading in silence. The silence was a fragile thing, and it shattered all at once with the heavy tramp of boots on the stone stairs. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of authority, of violence, of the end. The door was thrown open without a knock, and 6 municipal officers crowded into the small room. They were men of the district, rough-faced, smelling of tobacco and wine, their tricolor sashes stained with the grime of the city. One of them, a man whose voice grated like stone on iron, unrolled a decree from the Committee of Public Safety and began to read. The words were bureaucratic, cold, and deadly. The decree ordered that the son of Capet be separated from his mother immediately and placed in the most secure apartment of the tower, under the guardianship of a tutor appointed by the commune. The meaning took a moment to sink in, but when it did, it unleashed a scene of primal horror that those present would never forget. Marie Antoinette threw herself in front of the bed, her body becoming a physical shield between the men and her sleeping son. "You will not take him," she screamed, a sound that was less human and more like the cry of a wounded animal. "You will have to kill me first." The officers, startled by the ferocity of the woman they had been taught to despise as a weak, effeminate aristocrat, hesitated, but their orders were absolute. They advanced, threatening to drag the boy out by force. The child woke up screaming, terrified by the noise and the sight of his mother fighting with strange men. He clung to her skirts, sobbing, begging not to be taken away. Madame Elizabeth and Marie-Thérèse joined the fray, shielding the boy, creating a wall of weeping women against the brute force of the state. For a full hour, the battle raged. It was not a battle of weapons, but of wills. The officers threatened to call the guard up to kill them all. They threatened to kill the boy right there if the queen did not let go. They told her that her resistance was useless, that she was only making it harder for the child. Finally, exhausted, broken, and realizing that her resistance might indeed lead to the slaughter of her daughter and sister-in-law, Marie Antoinette's strength gave out. She lifted the boy whose tears were soaking her dress and sat him on the bed. She wiped his face, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "My child," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you must go. God will protect you." She forced herself to dress him, lingering over every button, smoothing his hair one last time, knowing with a mother's terrible instinct that she was touching him for the last time. When she finally handed him over to the officers, she did not look away. She watched as they grabbed his small arm, dragging him toward the door. The boy looked back, his eyes wide with panic, reaching out a hand that grasped only empty air. The door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. And from the other side, the queen could hear the fading footsteps of her son being marched away into the abyss. Louis Charles was not taken far, only down one floor to the apartment that had formerly belonged to his father, but he might as well have been transported to another planet. The room was stark, smelling of damp and stale smoke, and waiting for him, there was the man who would become the architect of his destruction, Antoine Simon. Simon was a cobbler by trade, a man of the people, a staunch Jacobin, who had been selected for this task not because he was an educator, but because he was trustworthy. He was 57 years old, a thick-set man with a harsh face and a loud, booming voice. He was not initially the sadistic monster of later royalist legend, but he was rough, uneducated, and completely, utterly unsuited to care for a traumatized prince. He saw his mission clearly. He was to turn this wolf cub into a man, a citizen, a sans-culotte. He was to scrub away the royalty like dirt from a boot. The first few days were a nightmare of disorientation for the boy. He sat in the corner of the room, weeping silently, refusing to speak, refusing to eat. He waited for his mother to come. Every time the door opened, his head would snap up, hope flaring in his eyes, only to be extinguished when he saw the rough face of Simon, or his wife. The wife, Marie-Jeanne Simon, was a simpler creature, occasionally showing flashes of rough kindness, but she was entirely subservient to her husband and the revolutionary cause. Simon found the boy's silence infuriating. He interpreted the child's grief as arrogance, as the haughtiness of the Capet bloodline. "You are not a prince here," Simon would shout, slamming his hand on the table. "You are Charles. You are a citizen. Do you hear me, Capet?" The name Capet was used like a slap in the face, a constant reminder of his fallen status. To break the boy's silence, Simon began a program of systematic intimidation. He would loom over the child, blowing smoke from his clay pipe directly into the boy's face, laughing when Louis Charles coughed and choked. It was the first step in dismantling the boy's physical dignity. The Republican education that followed was a grotesque parody of pedagogy. Simon's instructions were to make the boy forget his past, and he believed the best way to do this was to immerse him in the filth of the present. The physical transformation was the most immediate. The boy's mourning clothes, the fine black silk he had worn since his father's death, were stripped away and replaced with a carmagnole, the short jacket of the revolutionaries, and the red Phrygian cap of liberty. But the cap didn't fit. The boy's mass of golden curls was in the way. So the shears were brought out. In a brutal, jagged haircut, the iconic locks of the Dauphin were shorn off, falling to the floor like severed limbs. When Louis Charles looked in the mirror, the prince was gone. Staring back was a little sans-culotte, a miniature version of the men who had killed his father. This visual erasure was psychologically devastating. He no longer looked like himself. He looked like the enemy. But the true poison was administered through the mind. Simon was determined to toughen the boy, to cure him of the effeminacy that the revolutionaries believed was endemic to the aristocracy. This meant exposing him to the hyper-masculine, crude culture of the Paris streets. Alcohol became a tool of control. At meals, Simon would force the 8-year-old to drink wine, often heavily watered down at first, but increasingly potent as time went on. "Drink up, Capet. Only aristocrats drink water," Simon would roar. The alcohol, acting on a system that had never known it, made the boy dizzy, pliable, and sick. In this drunken haze, the lessons began. He was taught the songs of the Terror, the Marseillaise, the Carmagnole, and the Ça ira. The lyrics were obscene, violent, calling for the hanging of aristocrats and the blood of tyrants. Simon would stand over him, threatening him with a raised shoe, forcing him to sing louder and louder until the boy was shouting for the death of his own family without fully understanding the words he was spewing. One particularly cruel game involved the billiards table that had been set up in the room. Simon would play with the guards, drinking and gambling, while the boy was forced to fetch the balls. They treated him like a dog, whistling for him, kicking him if he was too slow. "Bring me the ball, Toad," Simon would yell. If the boy cried, he was mocked. "Look at him, crying like a girl, just like his mother." This was the constant refrain, the comparison to the mother. The revolutionaries were obsessed with the idea that Marie Antoinette had emasculated her son, that she had raised him to be soft, weak, and womanly. Therefore, to make him a man, they had to make him hate her. They had to sever the emotional bond by polluting the memory of her love. Simon began to tell the boy lies, terrible, complex lies. He told him that his mother didn't love him, that she had abandoned him, that she was a wicked woman who had betrayed France. He told him that if the Austrians won the war, they would come and kill him. The child, isolated, intoxicated, and terrified, began to lose his grip on reality. The man who fed him, the man who controlled his every waking moment, became the only authority he knew. A primitive form of Stockholm Syndrome began to set in. To survive, the boy had to please the monster. It was in this vulnerable state that the seeds of the ultimate betrayal were planted. The guards and Simon, in their drunken stupors, began to expose the child to language no boy should hear. They would mock the Austrian she-wolf and her lovers. They would teach the boy to curse, rewarding him when he used the foulest insults against his own blood. "Say it, Capet, denounce her." And the boy, desperate for a nod of approval, desperate to avoid a blow, would repeat the vile words. He would parrot them, perhaps not knowing their full meaning, but knowing that they held power. This was the beginning of the weaponization. The revolutionaries realized that the boy was a blank slate upon which they could write any narrative they chose. If they could get him to condemn his mother, what else could they get him to do? As August turned to September, the physical neglect began to set in alongside the psychological torment. Simon, though paid to care for the boy, was lazy and increasingly absorbed in his own importance as a guardian of the Republic. The boy's hygiene deteriorated. The distinct, meticulous cleanliness of the court was replaced by the grime of the prison. He was rarely bathed. His clothes were stained. Vermin began to appear in the bedding. But worse than the dirt was the growing isolation from the women upstairs. Marie Antoinette, Madame Elizabeth, and Marie Thérèse were kept in the room directly above. Sometimes, through the floorboards or the open windows, they could hear the sound of the boy singing the revolutionary songs. Imagine the torture for the mother, sitting in silence, hearing the drunken voice of her beloved son shouting insults about Madame Veto. The revolutionaries knew this. They enjoyed it. It was a special kind of cruelty, to use the son's voice to torment the mother before they killed her. But the Jacobins needed more than just a broken child. They needed a witness. The political situation in Paris was reaching a boiling point. The trial of the queen was inevitable. Robespierre and Hébert needed charges that would stick, charges that would dehumanize her so completely that no one would dare defend her. Treason was not enough. They needed moral depravity. The rumors of unnatural acts that had circulated in the pamphlets for years were now to be codified into legal evidence. They needed to prove that the Austrian woman had not only betrayed the state, but had corrupted the very laws of nature. And who better to testify to this corruption than the victim himself? The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. They would use the boy's re-education to construct a narrative of moral corruption. They began to observe the boy with a clinical predatory fascination. The child suffered from a physical ailment that caused him constant irritation and pain. In his innocence, the boy would often tend to his own discomfort. Simon and the guards watched this. They began to interpret these innocent actions through the lens of their own depravity. "Look," they would whisper, "he has been taught bad habits. Who taught him?" They began to question the boy, gently at first, then with more pressure. "Did your mother encourage this? Did your aunt play games with you?" The boy, confused, would try to answer. He remembered his mother tending to his wounds. He remembered her washing him. To a child, these were acts of love and care, but under the relentless, twisting questioning of the men, these memories were warped. "Yes," he would say, "she tended to me." "Aha," the men would exclaim, exchanging knowing glances. "And she told you to keep it secret?" The questions were leading, suggestive, designed to trap the child in a web of linguistic confusion. They were teaching him a new vocabulary, a vocabulary of sin. They introduced him to concepts far beyond his years, framing them as something the aristocracy practiced. The indoctrination was shifting from political hatred to psychological dismantling. They were preparing him for the interrogation that would seal his mother's fate. By October 1793, the boy was a shadow of the prince he had been. He was prone to fainting spells. His eyes were dull, flanked by dark circles. He jumped at loud noises. He had learned to laugh when Simon laughed, to curse when Simon cursed. He had become a mimic, a mirror reflecting the ugliness of his captors. The stage was set for the entrance of Jacques Hébert, the substitute of the procureur of the commune, the man who would take this raw, broken material and forge it into the blade of the guillotine. The separation was complete. The mother was gone, and in her place was a monster of the boy's own making, a phantom constructed by lies and fueled by fear. The Capet boy was ready to be used. The darkness of the temple was absolute, and in that darkness the ultimate betrayal was about to take place. The morning of October 6, 1793, broke gray and ominous over the temple, the light struggling to penetrate the thick grime on the windows of the tower. Inside the suffocating apartment, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the nervous sweat of a child who knew, with the instinct of the hunted, that the predators were closing in. Louis Charles, once the Dauphin of France and now merely the prisoner Capet, sat on a small wooden stool, his legs dangling, his eyes darting towards the heavy oak door. He was a ghost of the boy he had been only months before. The golden hair was gone, sheared close to the scalp in a ragged crop that left him looking vulnerable and exposed. His clothes, the rough trousers and jacket of a sans-culotte, hung loosely on his emaciated frame, a cruel mockery of the Republican citizen he was supposed to represent. But it was the eyes that told the true story, eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had been forced to witness the dismantling of his own soul. He was waiting, and he did not have to wait long. The door groaned open, and a procession of men entered the room, bringing with them the cold bureaucratic aura of the Revolutionary Tribunal. At the head of the group was Jacques Hébert, the substitute of the procureur of the Commune, a man whose very name struck terror into the hearts of the aristocracy. Hébert was the editor of the vile newspaper Le Père Duchesne, the mouthpiece of the most radical, bloodthirsty faction of the Revolution. He was a man obsessed with the idea of purity, which for him meant the total eradication of the gangrenous influence of the monarchy. To him, the boy sitting on the stool was not a child. He was a vessel of corruption, a carrier of the royal disease that had to be exposed before it could be destroyed. Behind him came Pierre Chaumet, the procurator, and a handful of other municipal officers, armed with quills, ink, and the grim determination of men who believed they were saving the nation. They did not greet the child. There were no pleasantries, no acknowledgement of his humanity. They simply set up a table in the center of the room, turning the prison cell into an ad hoc interrogation chamber. Antoine Simon, the brutish tutor who had spent the last 3 months breaking the boy's spirit, stood by the window, a smug grin plastered on his face. He nodded to Hébert, a silent signal that the work had been done, that the wolf cub was ready to perform. Hébert sat down, dipping his quill into the inkwell, the scratching sound echoing loudly in the silence. He looked at the boy with a gaze that was simultaneously clinical and predatory. "Citizen Capet," he began, his voice smooth and insinuating, "we are here to speak the truth. The Republic demands the truth. You know what the truth is, do you not?" The boy nodded weakly. He had learned that to agree was to survive. If he agreed, Simon would not hit him. If he agreed, he might get a glass of wine to dull the gnawing ache in his stomach. But Hébert was not asking about politics today. He was asking about something far darker. He began to question the child about the intimate details of his life with his mother and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth. The questions were structured with a diabolical cleverness, twisting innocent memories into grotesque parodies of sin. They asked about the sleeping arrangements at the Tuileries. They asked about the times he had been taken into his mother's bed when he was frightened by the storms or the mobs. "And when you were in the bed," Hébert pressed, leaning forward, "what did she do? Did she touch you? Did she teach you the secret games?" The child was confused. He remembered the warmth of his mother's embrace, the comfort of her hand stroking his hair. But the words Hébert used, words like pollution, indecency, and Italian practices, warped these memories. The men in the room were projecting their own obsession with the perceived sexual decadence of the aristocracy onto the blank canvas of the boy's mind. They suggested to him that his mother's affection was not maternal but carnal. They brought up the physical ailment, the hydrocele, which had caused the boy pain and required tending. "Did she touch you there?" Hébert asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Did she make you do things that made you feel strange? Under the relentless pressure, the boy began to crack. They were hustled out of the room before they could break the spell of the lie, leaving the boy alone once again with his tormentors, sobbing into his hands, the weight of his betrayal crushing him. The weapon was now forged. It was sharp, poisonous, and ready to be used. The trial of Marie Antoinette began a week later. On October 14th, 1793, the Conciergerie prison, where she was held, was the antechamber of death. The queen was a shadow of her former self, ravaged by severe illness, her hair turned stark white, her eyesight failing. Yet when she entered the courtroom, she carried herself with the undeniable bearing of a Habsburg. She answered the political charges with surprising acuity, dismissing the accusations of treason and financial waste with calm logic. The trial was not going as the prosecution had hoped. They were failing to humiliate her. She was appearing too human, too dignified. Then Hebert played his ace. He stood up, a smirk playing on his lips, and announced that there was a final charge, a charge so grave it revealed the true moral rot of the widow Capet. The courtroom went silent. He began to read the deposition of Louis Charles. He used the boy's own words, or rather the words forced into the boy's mouth, to paint a picture of a monster, a mother who had systematically corrupted her son to weaken his nature, to ruin his health through unspeakable indulgences so that she could rule through him. He accused her of the ultimate taboo of crimes against nature itself. The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the tricoteuses, the knitting women who usually jeered and screamed for blood, were struck dumb. The accusation was too much. It crossed a line that even the chaos of the revolution respected. It was grotesque. Marie Antoinette sat motionless on her wooden bench, her face a mask of stone. She did not look at Hebert. She did not look at the judges. She stared straight ahead into the void. He was 8 years old. He was intoxicated, terrified, and desperate to please the men who held his life in their hands. He looked at Simon for cues, and Simon nodded, mouthing the words he wanted to hear. Slowly, haltingly, Louis Charles began to repeat the script that had been drilled into him during the long, drunken nights of his education. Yes, he whispered. Yes, his mother had compromised him. Yes, his aunt had been there. Yes, they had taught him things no child should know. The scribes wrote furiously, their pens scratching across the parchment, recording the confession that would damn the Queen of France. They were not recording facts. They were recording the hallucinations of a tortured child, transmuted into legal evidence. But the horror was not over. Having secured the verbal confession they needed it signed, they pushed the parchment towards the boy. The text was a dense, legalistic nightmare, detailing dark and forbidden acts that no child should even know existed, let alone confess to. Louis Charles took the quill. His hand, once trained in the elegant script of the royal court, trembled violently. He could barely hold the pen. The signature he produced, Louis Charles Capet, was a jagged, broken scrawl, utterly unlike his former handwriting. It was the signature of a boy who was disintegrating. It remains to this day one of the most heartbreaking documents in the French National Archives, a graphical testament to the destruction of a soul. The next day, October 7th, the cruelty was ratcheted up another notch. The tribunal needed corroboration. They decided to confront the boy with his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, and his sister, Marie-Thérèse, to force him to repeat the accusations to their faces. The two women were brought down from the tower, unaware of the specific nature of the horror that awaited them. When they entered the room and saw Louis Charles, they rushed to embrace him, shocked by his altered appearance, his cropped hair, and his hollow eyes. but the guards pulled them back. Hebert stood between them, holding the signed deposition like a weapon. He read the accusations aloud. The effect was shattering. Madame Elizabeth, a woman of profound piety and gentleness, stared at her nephew in disbelief. "The king?" she gasped, using the title they still honored in private. "You said these things?" The boy, unable to meet her gaze, looked at the floor. He was trapped. If he denied it now, Simon would punish him. The men would hurt him. The fear of immediate pain outweighed the abstract concept of truth. He mumbled a confirmation. "Yes, Aunt, it is true." The sister, Marie-Thérèse, looked at her brother with a mixture of horror and pity, realizing that something fundamental in him had been broken. The president of the tribunal, seeing her silence, pressed her. "The accused has not answered the charge regarding her son." It was then that Marie Antoinette rose. It was the moment that would define her legacy. She did not scream. She did not weep. She turned away from the judges, turning her back on the men who were trying to destroy her, and looked directly at the crowd, at the faces of the ordinary women of Paris who had come to watch her die. Her voice, though weak from illness, carried to the back of the room, vibrating with a raw, primal intensity. "If I have not answered," she said, "it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother." She paused, her eyes sweeping the gallery. "I appeal to all mothers in this room. Is such a crime even possible?" The reaction was electric. A murmur of sympathy, involuntary and powerful, rippled through the crowd. For a moment, the political divide vanished. Every woman in that room, regardless of her politics, felt the visceral horror of the accusation. They knew that no mother, no matter how depraved, would do what was described. They saw not a queen, but a mother being tortured with the body of her own child. The proceeding was momentarily derailed. The judges, sensing the shift in the mood, hurriedly moved to close the session. They knew they had lost the moral argument. They would have to rely on the political one to kill her. Marie Antoinette was condemned, of course. The verdict had been decided before the trial began, but as she rode the tumbril to the guillotine on October 16th, her hands bound behind her back, sitting upright on the wooden plank, she possessed a tragic grandeur that her enemies could not strip away. She had won the moral victory in the courtroom. She had exposed the revolution's capacity for inhumanity. But the cost of that victory was the soul of her son. While the mother's head fell into the basket, the son remained in the tower, ignorant of the role he had played in her death. No one told him she was dead. Simon and the guards continued their routine, but the atmosphere had changed. The boy was no longer useful as a witness. He was just a loose end, a remnant. The education began to lose its intensity, replaced by a cold, indifferent neglect that was, in its own way, even more cruel. The boy had served his purpose. He had destroyed the queen. Now the Republic had to decide what to do with the broken tool. As the winter of 1793 set in, the isolation of Louis Charles deepened. The initial plan to raise him as a sans-culotte began to fade, replaced by a simpler, darker objective: erasure. He was a problem that needed to disappear. He was still the king to the royalists, still a threat. But he was also a damaged child who knew too many secrets, whose very existence was a reminder of the shameful depths to which the tribunal had sunk. The active torture of the interrogation room was replaced by the passive torture of the dungeon. The window was boarded up more securely. The walks in the garden became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The wolf cub was being buried alive brick by brick, silence by silence, and in the dark, the child waited. He waited for the mother he had betrayed to come and save him. He waited for the aunt he had accused to forgive him. He did not know that the guillotine had already silenced one and would soon claim the other. He was alone with the ghosts he had been forced to conjure, alone with the memory of the words he had signed, words that would hang over his memory for centuries like a shroud. The tragedy of the parents was over. The tragedy of the orphan was just beginning. The long, slow martyrdom of the temple was entering its final, most harrowing phase. The winter of 1794 brought with it a cold that snapped the bones and froze the skin, but inside the temple tower, the temperature was dropping in a different, more permanent way. With the execution of Marie Antoinette, the furious energy that had surrounded the young prince began to dissipate, replaced by a chilling bureaucratic indifference. The boy had served his purpose. He had been the star witness in the Republic's greatest show trial. He had parroted the obscenities taught to him. He had signed the paper that condemned his mother, and in doing so, he had destroyed his own political value. To the Royalists, he was now a tainted figure, a little Jacobin who had betrayed his own blood. To the revolutionaries, he was a useless artifact, a remnant of a dynasty they had already beheaded. He was an embarrassment. And so the Jacobin leadership made a decision that was, in its own way, far more cruel than the guillotine. They decided to stop trying to re-educate him. They decided instead to forget him. On January 19, 1794, Antoine Simon resigned his post. The cobbler had grown tired of the confinement. He wanted to return to his local politics, to the freedom of the streets. His departure marked the end of the phase of active abuse and the beginning of the phase of absolute isolation. The Committee of Public Safety did not appoint a new tutor. There would be no more lessons, no more drunken songs, no more walks in the garden. Instead, the municipal council decreed a policy of strict enclosure. They ordered the room to be sealed. Carpenters were brought in to secure the heavy oak door. They drove massive nails and screws into the wood, sealing it shut from the outside. The windows, already barred, were further obstructed with heavy shutters that allowed only a sliver of gray light to filter through near the ceiling. The fireplace was boarded up, cutting off the only source of heat. The door was modified to include a small guichet, a wicket or trapdoor, barred with iron, waist high, through which food and water could be passed. When the last nail was driven home and the hammer stopped ringing, the silence that descended on the room was total. Louis Charles, not yet 9 years old, was now the sole inhabitant of a stone tomb. He was alone, truly, utterly alone. The guards were stationed outside the door, in the antechamber, with strict orders. Do not speak to the prisoner. Do not open the door. Do not answer his cries. The wolf cub was to be left to the darkness. The 6 months that followed, from January to July 1794, constitute one of the darkest chapters in the history of human cruelty. It was an experiment in sensory deprivation and neglect performed on a child. Inside the cell, time ceased to have meaning. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only the eternal gloom of the sealed room. The boy, who had once been surrounded by the glittering court of Versailles, was now reduced to a primitive, animalistic existence. He had a pitcher of water and an earthen pot for a toilet, but the pot was too heavy for him to empty through the high wicket, and the guards refused to help. So the waste began to accumulate. It piled up in the corners, then spread across the floor, creating a miasma of toxic fumes that filled the unventilated space. The air became unbreathable, thick with the stench of ammonia and decay. In this fetid darkness, the boy's mind began to unravel. At first, he likely cried out. He would have called for Simon, for his mother, for anyone, but the only response was the echoing silence or the rough laughter of the guards on the other side of the wall, drinking and playing cards indifferent to the dying child a few feet away. He began to believe that he had been abandoned by God himself. The guilt of what he had done, the memory of the accusation against his mother, must have gnawed at him. In the superstitious mind of a child, this darkness was surely a punishment. He was in hell. He stopped speaking. The articulate, bright prince who had charmed the courtiers fell into a profound mutism. He ceased to ask for anything. When the trapdoor opened twice a day, a bowl of coarse soup and a piece of bread were shoved through. He would eat in the dark, fumbling for the food with filthy hands, like a creature in a burrow. The physical deterioration was rapid and horrifying. Without water to wash, his skin became caked with dirt and excrement. His clothes, which were never changed, turned into stiff, rotting rags that fused to his flesh. And then came the vermin. The smell attracted rats, huge, bold sewer rats that scurried through the darkness, gnawing at his shoes, his food, and eventually, him. He was too weak to fight them off. He huddled on his mattress, pulling a tattered blanket over his head, listening to the scratching of claws on the stone floor. Fleas and lice infested his hair and body, causing constant maddening itching that he scratched until he bled, creating open sores that festered in the filthy environment. His limbs, some unused and malnourished, began to atrophy. His knees swelled with the tumors of scrofula, the king's evil, a form of tuberculosis that attacks the lymph nodes and bones. He was slowly rotting alive. Outside the tower, the Great Terror was reaching its bloody crescendo. Robespierre, the incorruptible, was purging the enemies of the Republic with a maniacal efficiency. The guillotine at the Place de la Révolution was working overtime, claiming Danton, Desmoulins, and even Hébert, the very man who had tormented the prince. But inside the cell, the political storms were irrelevant. The boy knew nothing of the executions. He knew only the cold, the dark, and the hunger. There is a terrible irony in the fact that while the Republic was proclaiming the rights of man, it was subjecting a single child to a torture that violated every law of humanity. The guards, who were technically citizens serving the nation, became jailers of the worst kind, not through active malice, but through a terrifying apathy. They simply didn't care. To them, he was not a boy. He was capé, a symbol, a thing. There are no records of what Louis Charles thought during those 6 months of the walled-in period because there were no witnesses. We can only imagine the hallucinations that must have haunted him in the dark. Did he see his father? Did he see the face of his mother as she looked in the courtroom? Did he dream of the gardens of Trianon? Or did his mind simply shut down, retreating into a catatonic state to protect itself from the horror of his reality? Historians believe that this was the period where the boy died psychologically. The vibrant personality of the Dauphin was extinguished, leaving behind only a biological shell that was slowly failing. The spring turned to summer, and the heat returned to Paris, making the atmosphere in the sealed room even more unbearable. The stench from the tower was said to be so foul that it could be smelled on the staircase. The guards complained of the odor, but did nothing to investigate. They were afraid. The orders were strict. Isolation. To break the seal was to risk the wrath of the Committee of Public Safety. And so, the child lay in his own waste, consumed by fever, his body covered in sores, his mind lost in the void. He was 9 years old. Then came the thunderclap of 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794. The wheel of the revolution turned once more. Robespierre fell. The man who had orchestrated the terror was himself dragged to the guillotine, his jaw shattered by a bullet, screaming as the blade fell. The regime of extreme virtue and extreme violence collapsed. The Thermidorians who took power were desperate to distance themselves from the excesses of the past year. They wanted to restore some semblance of order and humanity, and inevitably, their attention turned to the prisoners in the temple. On the night of July 28th, a man named Paul Barras, one of the leaders of the new government, came to the temple. He was making a tour of the prisons, ensuring that the tyrant's orders were being reviewed. When he arrived at the tower, he asked about the children of Louis XVI. He visited the Princess Marie-Thérèse on the floor above. She was thin and grief-stricken, but alive and clean. Then he asked about the Dauphin. The guards hesitated. They pointed to the nailed-shut door. They told him that the little Capet had not been seen for 6 months. Barras ordered the door to be opened. The carpenters were summoned back. It took time to pry the heavy bars and nails loose. The sound of the hammers must have been deafening to the boy inside, a terrifying intrusion into his silent world. When the door finally creaked open, a blast of noxious, putrid air rushed out, so overpowering that the men recoiled, gagging. Barras and his aides covered their faces with handkerchiefs and stepped into the gloom. At first they saw nothing. The room was pitch black. They called for lanterns. As the light flooded the space, it revealed a scene from a nightmare. The walls were covered in cobwebs and filth. The floor was a carpet of rotting food, excrement, and trash. And there in the corner, on a filthy mattress that was teeming with bugs, lay a small, curled-up figure. He did not move. He did not speak. He stared at the light with large, unblinking eyes that seemed devoid of intelligence. His head was covered in scabs. His fingernails were like claws. He was a skeleton wrapped in gray skin, his knees swollen to the size of melons. Barras, a hardened soldier and politician, was horrified. He approached the bed. "Capet?" he asked gently. The boy did not answer. He only shrank back against the wall, trembling. He looked like a wild animal caught in a trap. The men realized with a jolt of shame that this was the King of France. This broken, rotting thing was the child who had been born to the fanfare of cannons. The reality of what the Republic had done was laid bare in that room. It was not justice, it was atrocity. Barras immediately ordered that the boy be cleaned and that the conditions be improved. He appointed a new guardian, a man named Jean-Jacques Laurent, a Creole from Martinique who was known for his gentle manner. Laurent arrived the next day, and what he found broke his heart. He had to bathe the child multiple times just to remove the layers of grime. He had to cut away the rotting clothes that had stuck to the boy's sores. He found that the child's body was covered in bites from the rats, and through it all, the boy remained silent. He watched Laurent with suspicious, fearful eyes, flinching at every touch. Laurent began the slow, painful process of trying to bring the child back to the land of the living. He had the room cleaned and whitewashed. He opened the windows to let in the fresh air and the sunlight, the first sunlight the boy had seen in half a year. He brought him clean clothes and decent food. He spoke to him softly, trying to coax a word, a sound, anything. But the damage was deep. Louis Charles would gaze out the window at the sky, his expression vacant. The Republican education and the solitary confinement had done their work. The memory of the past was gone, or buried so deep it could not be reached. However, the new government faced a dilemma. The boy was alive, but he was a wreck. If the public saw him, if the royalists saw him, the scandal would be immense. The Republic had claimed to be liberating the child from the tyranny of his parents, only to destroy him more thoroughly than any tyrant could. Rumors began to circulate in Paris. People whispered that the boy in the tower was not the real Dauphin. How could a prince be reduced to this? They whispered that the real king had been rescued during the chaos of the terror, smuggled out in a laundry basket or a coffin, and that the child in the bed was a mute peasant boy, a substitute, an impostor brought in to die in his place. These rumors were fueled by the boy's silence and his altered appearance. He no longer looked like the portraits. His growth was stunted. His face was ravaged by illness. Even his sister Marie-Thérèse, who was finally allowed to see him, barely recognized him. She was shocked by his condition, by his refusal to speak. She tried to remind him of their parents, of their games, but he would only stare at her, a wall of trauma standing between them. The seeds of the lost Dauphin mythology were being watered by the very reality of his suffering. The truth that a child could be so broken that he became unrecognizable was too painful for many to accept. It was easier to believe in a conspiracy, a daring escape, a hidden prince waiting in the wings. But there was no escape. As the autumn of 1794 set in, the boy's health continued to decline. The tuberculosis was systemic. It was in his bones, his joints, his lungs. He grew weaker by the day. The new guardians, Laurent, and later a man named Gomin, tried their best. They brought him toys, flowers, even a little dog to keep him company. For a brief moment, the presence of the dog seemed to spark a flicker of the old Louis Charles. He would stroke the animal's fur, a faint smile touching his lips. It was the first sign of emotion he had shown in a year. But the dog was taken away by officials who feared it was a sanitary risk, plunging him back into despair. The tragedy of Louis Charles in late 1794 is a quiet one. It is not the dramatic tragedy of the guillotine, but the slow, agonizing tragedy of a candle burning out. He spent his days sitting by the window, watching the clouds drift over Paris, a city that had forgotten him. He was a prisoner of the state, but he was also a prisoner of his own broken body. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a whisper. He never asked about his mother. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps the silence of the room had told him everything he needed to know. As winter approached again, the doctors were finally called in. They were shocked by what they found. The celebrated physician Desault examined the boy and shook his head. "It is not a disease we are fighting," he reportedly said. "It is a life that is ebbing away." The boy had no will to live. The psychological will to survive had been extinguished in the dark months of the solitary confinement. He was simply waiting for the end. The Republic could clean his room, they could give him soup, but they could not give him back his soul. That had been stolen by Simon, by Hebert, by the nails in the door. The boy who sat in the tower was a vessel of sorrow, a living testament to the failure of the Revolution's promise of fraternity. And as the year turned to 1795, the shadow of death began to creep closer, ready to claim the last hostage of the monarchy. The spring of 1795 blossomed over Paris with a cruel vibrancy, the scent of lilacs and acacia drifting even into the dark courtyards of the temple, mocking the decay inside. While the city outside was beginning to breathe again, shaking off the grim paralysis of the terror and embracing a new hedonistic era under the Directory, the life in the tower was shrinking to a singular, agonizing point. The boy, Louis Charles, was now 10 years old, but he looked like an elderly man shrunk into a child's frame. The tuberculosis, fed by the months of darkness and squalor, had ravaged him completely. His joints were swollen into grotesque knots, his spine was curved, and his skin was translucent, stretched tight over fragile bones. He spent his days in a kind of twilight state, drifting between consciousness and delirium, a silent spectator to his own ending. In May, the mystery deepened. Dr. Desault, the eminent physician who had been treating the prince, and who had, in a rare act of courage, petitioned the government to send the boy to the countryside for fresh air, suddenly died. He died violently and quickly, leading to immediate whispers in the streets that he had been poisoned. The rumor mill churned. Had Dassault seen something he shouldn't have? Had he realized the boy was an impostor? Or conversely, had he tried too hard to save the true king, inconveniencing a government that wanted a quiet death? His death left the boy without a medical advocate for several critical days, a gap in care that sealed his fate. The suspicion surrounding Dassault's demise added another layer of fog to the history of the temple, a fog that would obscure the truth for generations. To replace him, the authorities appointed Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan. Pelletan was a man of science, but he was also a man of deep, suppressed humanity. When he arrived at the tower, he was horrified not just by the medical condition of the child, but by the profound loneliness that surrounded him. He demanded that the blinds be removed from the windows. He insisted that the boy be moved to a room with better ventilation. But it was too little, too late. The damage was structural. The boy's constitution was shattered. Yet Pelletan noted something that the guards had missed: the boy's gentleness. Despite the years of abuse, despite the education by Simon, the crude language and the revolutionary songs had faded away. In his final weakness, the boy had reverted to his essential nature, polite, patient, and heartbreakingly grateful for the smallest kindness. When Pelletan gave him a drink, the boy would try to smile, a ghost of the charm that had once captivated Versailles. The first week of June 1795 marked the final descent. The fever spiked, consuming what little strength remained. The boy began to suffer from hallucinations, though they were not the terrifying visions of the dark months. He spoke of music. On the afternoon of June 7th, he turned to Gomin, his guardian, and whispered that he heard heavenly music coming from above. "Do you not hear it?" he asked, his eyes wide and bright with a feverish intensity. "It is the voice of my mother." It was the first time in over a year that he had spoken of Marie Antoinette. The silence he had maintained to protect himself was breaking down as the barrier between life and death thinned. He no longer feared the spies or the guards. He was listening to a sound that they could not hear. The end came on June 8th, 1795. It was a warm, humid afternoon. The sounds of the city, the rattle of carriages, the shouts of vendors, drifted through the open window, a reminder of the indifferent world that continued to turn. Louis Charles lay in the arms of Lasne, one of his guardians, who had come to pity the child. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Dr. Pelletan had visited earlier, but knew there was nothing to be done. The struggle was over. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the boy's breathing changed. He opened his eyes and looked at Lasne. According to the testimony later given by the guardian, the boy said, "I have something to tell you." But the sentence was never finished. The light faded from his eyes. The head, heavy with its tragic history, fell back. Louis XVII, the king without a crown, the orphan of the temple, was dead. He was 10 years, 2 months, and 12 days old. The moment the heart stopped beating, the political problem of the living heir vanished, only to be instantly replaced by the political problem of the dead victim. The authorities were terrified of the optics. They needed to prove that the boy had died of natural causes, not murder. They needed to prove it was actually him and not a substitute. And so the next morning, June 9th, a team of 4 doctors, including Dr. Pelletan, arrived to perform the autopsy. The autopsy of Louis XVII is a scene of Gothic horror. It took place in the very room where he had died. The small scarred body was laid out on a table near the window to catch the light. The doctors, men of reason and science, took up their scalpels to dismantle the remains of the monarchy. As they cut into the body, they found the catastrophic evidence of neglect. The brain was liquefied, the lungs were riddled with tubercles, The intestines were knotted with infection. They cataloged every scar, every tumor, writing a report that was a damning indictment of the prison conditions. They confirmed that the cause of death was overwhelming scrofula, tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, exacerbated by long-standing sadness and lack of movement. But in the middle of this grisly procedure, a moment occurred that would change history, a moment of theft that would take 2 centuries to resolve. Dr. Pelletan, while his colleagues were distracted, or perhaps turning away from the stench, made a split-second decision. He felt a profound sense of tragedy, a need to preserve something of this royal child whose body was about to be dumped in a common grave. With a sleight of hand, he removed the boy's heart. He did not put it back in the chest cavity. Instead, he wrapped it in a handkerchief and shoved it into his pocket. He smuggled the heart out of the temple, hidden against his own ribs. He took it home and placed it in a jar of alcohol on his shelf. This stolen heart, shriveled, hardened, and traveling through history like a macabre relic, would become the only physical link left to the truth. The burial took place on the night of June 10th. It was a secret, hurried affair, designed to prevent any royalist demonstrations. The body was placed in a simple wooden coffin. There was no funeral mass, no prayers, no family. Under the cover of darkness, a small procession moved through the streets to the cemetery of Sainte Marguerite. There were no mourners, only soldiers and officials. The coffin was lowered into a mass grave, an unmarked pit filled with the bones of the anonymous dead of Paris. Quicklime was poured over the box to hasten decomposition, to erase the identity of the corpse, to ensure that the site could never become a shrine. The earth was shoveled back in, and the ground was stamped flat. The Republic believed it had buried the past. However, the secrecy of the burial had the exact opposite effect. Because no one saw the body, because the funeral was held at night, because the doctors had died or stayed silent, the rumors exploded. "He is not dead," the people whispered. "They buried a pauper. The real king has escaped." The legend of the escape took root instantly. It was fueled by the guilt of the nation. It was easier to believe that the boy had been whisked away by a daring knight than to accept that France had let a child rot to death in a dark room. Within months of the death, the first false Dauphin began to appear. Men and sometimes even women emerged from the shadows claiming to be the escaped prince. They told fantastical stories of being smuggled out in laundry baskets, of being swapped with a sick peasant boy, of living in secret in the Vendée or across the ocean in America. The lost Dauphin became the most enduring mystery of the 19th century. It became a cottage industry of impostors and hope. The real tragedy, the boy dying alone in the tower, was eclipsed by the romantic fiction of the boy who lived. Meanwhile, Dr. Pelletan kept the heart, but the heart's journey was just beginning. Over the next few years, the alcohol in the jar evaporated. The heart dried out, becoming a hard, stone-like object. It was almost thrown away by a student. It was stolen. It was returned. It survived the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars and the Bourbon Restoration. It was offered to Louis XVIII, the boy's uncle, who refused it, not believing it was genuine. It passed from hand to hand, a unwanted relic of a shameful past, sitting in dusty cabinets and velvet boxes, traveling across Europe while the world argued about who the real Louis XVII was. The mystery tore the royalist movement apart. Hundreds of claimants would eventually step forward, asserting that the boy in the mass grave was a substitute and that the true king was living in exile. The ghost of the temple refused to rest, but the truth lay in the dried, shriveled object that Pelletan had stolen. For 200 years, that heart waited. It waited through the rise and fall of empires, through 2 world wars, through the invention of forensic science. It waited for the technology to catch up with the lie. The story of Louis XVII did not end in the cemetery of Sainte Marguerite in 1795. It was suspended there, caught in a limbo of doubt and conspiracy. The agony of the child was over, but the agony of the truth was far from finished. The world had buried a body, but it had not buried the question. And as the 20th century dawned, the heart of the matter was sitting in a crystal urn in the royal crypt, silent, waiting to speak its final irrefutable word. For decades, and then for centuries, the void left by the unmarked grave in Sainte Marguerite was filled with the only thing that could grow in such darkness, a wild, desperate hope. The refusal of the French people, and indeed of the world, to accept the miserable death of the child in the tower, birthed the legend of the lost Dauphin. It was a collective psychological defense mechanism. It was simply too painful, too shameful to believe that a civilized nation had allowed its own royal child to rot into a skeleton in a sealed room. And so, the narrative of the escape was born. It was whispered that agents of the royalists had swapped the prince with a sickly peasant boy or a deaf-mute orphan, smuggling the true king out in a laundry basket, or inside a hollowed-out log, or under the skirts of a washerwoman. This belief was so potent that it summoned Louis XVII into existence from thin air. In the chaos of post-revolutionary Europe, over 100 men stepped forward, claiming to be the escaped king. They appeared in every corner of the globe: a cobbler in Prussia, a clockmaker in London, a missionary in the forests of North America, a beggar in Paris. The most famous and convincing of these was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a German clockmaker who arrived in Paris in the 1830s. He bore a striking resemblance to the Bourbon. He had the blue eyes, the heavy jaw, and, most chillingly, he seemed to possess intimate memories of the court that only the Dauphin could know. He knew about a secret hiding place in a cabinet at Versailles. He recalled specific conversations with the Duchess of Angoulême, the surviving sister, Marie-Thérèse. He convinced former servants, governesses, and even legal experts. For a time, it seemed that history might be rewritten, that the boy had indeed survived the Republican education and the accusations of vice, escaping to live a life in exile. But while the impostors clamored for recognition, the true evidence lay silent and forgotten, hidden in a jar of alcohol on a dusty shelf. The heart that Dr. Pelletan had stolen during the autopsy in 1795 had embarked on a bizarre and perilous odyssey of its own, a journey that mirrored the turbulent history of France itself. After Pelletan stole it, he kept it as a sacred relic, a shriveled prune of royal flesh. When the Bourbons were restored to the throne in 1814, Pelletan tried to present the heart to Louis XVIII, the boy's uncle. But the king, pragmatic and perhaps wishing to avoid the messy reminder of his family's martyrdom, refused to see him. The heart was then offered to the Duchess of Angoulême, the orphan of the temple, the sister who had survived the tower. But she, too, turned away. Perhaps she could not bear to look at the physical remnant of the brother she had failed to save, or perhaps she had been seduced by the claims of Naundorf and believed her brother was still alive. Rejected by its own blood, the heart remained with the doctor. Its journey grew stranger. During the Revolution of 1830, the Louvre was stormed, and Pelletan's son, who had inherited the relic, had to fight off looters who smashed the jar. The heart was tossed into a pile of debris, only to be miraculously recovered days later in the sand. It passed through the hands of priests and princes, eventually finding sanctuary with the Spanish branch of the Bourbon family. It was not until 1975 that the heart finally returned to France, brought to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the ancient necropolis of the French kings. There, it was placed in a crystal urn, not in the main crypt, but in a side chapel, a provisional resting place for a provisional king. It sat there for 25 years, a dry, stone-hard object, silently mocking the historians who argued over the fate of the boy. Was it the heart of the prince, or was it the heart of the substitute, the peasant boy, who died in his place? Or perhaps it was just a random organ stolen by an ambitious doctor. The answer arrived with the new millennium. In the year 2000, the cold certainty of science was finally applied to the hot passions of history. A team of geneticists led by Professor Jean-Jacques Casimir of the University of Leuven and Dr. Ernst Brinkmann of the University of Münster was given permission to solve the mystery. They removed a tiny fragment of the heart, a piece of muscle tissue no larger than a grain of rice. The challenge was immense. The DNA was degraded, broken down by 2 centuries of alcohol, dryness, and exposure. But they managed to extract mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively from mother to child. To identify the boy, they needed the mother. They turned to the hair of Marie Antoinette, preserved in a locket during her lifetime, and they compared it to DNA samples from living descendants of the Habsburg line, including Queen Anne of Romania and her brother. The world waited. The stakes were not just historical, they were emotional. If the DNA did not match, the Naundorf theorists would be vindicated, and the history of the revolution would have to be rewritten. If it did match, the final door of the temple prison would slam shut forever. The results were announced in a press conference that felt more like a coroner's inquest into the soul of France. The DNA sequences were identical. The heart in the jar belonged to a child who was the direct maternal descendant of Marie Antoinette. At the same time, DNA tests performed on the remains of Naundorf proved conclusively that he was not a Bourbon. The clockmaker was a fraud. The escape was a myth. The truth was the tragedy. The boy who died in the filth and darkness of the Temple Tower on June 8, 1795, was indeed Louis XVII. On June 8, 2004, exactly 209 years after his death, France finally gave the lost Dauphin his funeral. It was a solemn, mournful occasion at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The crystal urn containing the heart was carried through the nave, draped in the royal purple and the fleur-de-lis. Representatives of the royal houses of Europe stood alongside officials of the French Republic. It was a burial of reconciliation. The heart was placed in the royal crypt, interred next to the graves of his parents, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. After 2 centuries of wandering, the little Capet had finally come home. But the interment of the heart did more than just solve a mystery. It forced us to confront the full, unvarnished horror of the story we have just told. The scientific confirmation that the boy in the tower was the true prince means that the victim of the incest accusation was not a substitute, but the son himself. It means that the child who was force-fed alcohol, taught to curse his own blood, and manipulated by Hébert into signing that monstrous deposition was indeed the sensitive golden-haired boy born at Versailles. This realization casts a terrifying light on the queer scandal weaponized by the revolution. The Jacobins did not just destroy a symbol, they destroyed a specific human psychology. They took a child, and to prove that monarchy was unnatural, they forced him to commit the ultimate unnatural act, the betrayal of his mother through a lie of sexual perversion. The deposition of 1793 remains one of the most painful documents in human history, not because of what it says, but because of who signed it. The shaky, broken signature of Louis Charles Capet is the graphic record of a soul being dismantled. The story of Louis XVII is often treated as a footnote to the French Revolution, a tragic sidebar to the glorious march of liberty. But in truth, it is the mirror in which the revolution sees its own dark reflection. It demonstrates the dangerous ease with which political ideology can rationalize cruelty. The men who tormented the child, Simon, Hébert, Chaumette, were not all psychopaths in the clinical sense. Many were patriots who believed that the end justified the means, that the destruction of the wolf cub was necessary for the safety of the Republic. They believed that by stripping the boy of his royalty, by reducing him to a vessel of vice, they were cleansing the nation. Instead, they left a stain that time cannot wash away. The lost Dauphin was never truly lost. We knew where he was the entire time. He was behind the door we nailed shut. He was in the silence we refused to break. The legacy of Louis XVII is not a political one. He never ruled, he passed no laws, he won no battles. His legacy is one of profound, haunting victimhood. He reminds us that when we dehumanize our enemies, when we use the most vulnerable among us as weapons in our culture wars, we lose something of our own humanity.